Production by Lianggu, Lin's shop. Author, Mao Dun. 1. Miss Lin pursed her lips when she came back from school that day. She took off her school bag, and instead of going to the mirror to comb her hair and apply powder, she fell on the bed and stared at the ceiling in trance. Xiaohua also jumped on the bed. Rubbing against Miss Lin's waist, she let out 2 moans. Miss Lin instinctively reached out and touched Xiaohua's head, then turned over, buried her face in the pillow, and shouted, "Dash. Mom." No answer. Mom's room is next door. My mother always loved her only daughter. When her daughter came back, she would waddle over and ask her if she was hungry. Mom had kept some good things. Otherwise, she would have to buy a bowl of wontons quickly. But something went wrong today. There were clearly voices in Mom's room. And I heard my mother burping, but she didn't even answer. Miss Lin turned over on the bed again, raised her head, and planned to eavesdrop on whom her mother was talking to, so she quietly lowered her voice. However, I couldn't hear clearly, only my mother's hiccups. It drifted intermittently to Miss Lin's ears. Suddenly my mother's voice rose a little higher, as if she was very angry, and a few words were clearly audible, dash. It drifted intermittently to Miss Lin's ears. Suddenly my mother's voice rose a little higher, as if she was very angry, and a few words were clearly audible, dash. This is also a Japanese product, and that is also a Japanese product, eh. Miss Lin jumped violently. It was as if there were a lot of short hair stuck to my neck during a haircut, and I felt irritated all over. It was precisely because of this issue of Japanese goods that she was laughed at and scolded by others in school, and she came home unhappy. She pushed away Xiaohua, who came to her again. He jumped up and peeled off the newly made emerald green fake fur kudzu camel hair cheongsam. He shook it a few times in his hand and sighed. It is said that these beautiful fake fur kudzu and camel hair come from the east. She lifted up the camel hair cheongsam. He pulled out the small leather box from under the bed, opened the lid of the box angrily, and threw the box bottom up onto the bed. Colorful clothes and miscellaneous items rolled all over the bed. Xiaohua was startled, jumped out of bed, and turned around. But he jumped on a chair and squatted down to look at its mistress. Miss Lin's hands dug into the pile of clothes for a while, then she stood in front of the bed, lost in thought. The clothes and miscellaneous items are getting cuter and cuter, but they also look more and more like Oriental goods. Can't wear them all? But she couldn't bear to part with it, and her father might not be willing to make a new one. Miss Lin couldn't help but have red eyes. She loves these Japanese goods, but she hates those Japanese people. Why would she send troops to attack the 3 eastern provinces? Otherwise, who will laugh and scold me if I wear Japanese goods? Well. Suddenly there was this sound from the door. Then came Mrs. Lin's swaying slim figure. I saw the clothes scattered all over the bed, and then I saw my daughter standing in front of the bed in a trance wearing only a woolen short coat. Aunt Lin's surprise was no small matter. The more anxious she felt, the more, she said, and she couldn't say a word for the time being. Miss Lin flew to her mother's side and said with a sad face, "Oh my God. They're all Japanese goods. What should I wear tomorrow?" Mrs. Lin shook her head and just hiccuped. She held her daughter's shoulder with one hand and rubbed her breast with the other. After a while, she struggled to say a few words, dash. Why did you take off all of your clothes, naked? Pay attention to the problem of freezing, my problem, I had this illness the year I gave birth to you, and, it's gotten worse recently. Dash. Oh my God. Can you tell me what to wear? I had no choice but to hide at home and not go out. They wanted to laugh at me and scold me. But Mrs. Lin didn't answer. She hiccuped all the way. He walked to the bed and picked out the camel hair cheongsam, put it on her daughter, patted the bed and asked her to sit down. The little flower came to Miss Lin's feet again, raised its head, squinted its eyes and looked at Aunt Lin, then at Miss Lin, then it lazily leaned on Miss Lin's instep. Use Miss Lin's soles to rub its belly. Miss Lin kicked Xiaohua away, leaned over, and lay on the bed, hiding her face behind her mother. Neither of them spoke for the time being. The mother is busy burping, and the daughter is busy thinking about how to go out tomorrow. This problem of Japanese goods not only affects what Ms. Lin wears, but also what she uses. It is said that her cosmetic wallet and mechanical pencils, which are often envied by her classmates, are also Japanese goods, but she loves them. These little gadgets. Grandma, are you hungry? After Aunt Lin sat still for a while, she gradually stopped typing a few times, and then started her daily routine of loving her daughter. I'm not hungry. Oh, my God, why do you always ask me if I'm hungry? I'm not hungry, but the most important thing is how to go to school tomorrow without clothes. Miss Lin said coquettishly, still lying with her body bent like that, still hiding her face behind her mother's back. Aunt Lin, who had never understood why her daughter complained that she had no clothes to wear, heard this for the third time and couldn't stop paying attention. But her damn hiccups came again and again in a very unflattering way. Just at this moment, Mr. Lin walked in, holding a note in his hand, and his face seemed to be covered with a layer of dust. He saw Mrs. Lin hiccuping. His daughter was lying on the bed among the piles of clothes scattered all over the bed. He had already expected it, and his brows furrowed tightly. He called his daughter's name and said, Mingxiu, is there any anti-Japanese association in your school? This letter was just sent. He said that if you wear Japanese clothes tomorrow, they will burn them, lawless words, ahem, It's really unreasonable. Who doesn't have Japanese goods on his body, but he has chosen to cause trouble in our family? Which foreign goods shop is not full of Japanese goods? But my shop is against the law and must be sealed. Duh. Mr. Lin added these words angrily, and then sat slumped in a chair beside the bed. Save the suffering Guanyin, Dad. I also have an old-fashioned cotton-padded jacket, which is not from Japan, but people will laugh at me when I wear it. After a while, Miss Lin sat up from the bed and said that she had planned to further ask her father to make a new dress that was not Japanese. But seeing the wrong look on his father's face, he didn't dare to take the risk. At the same time, the ridicule of that old cotton-padded jacket unfolded in her imagination, and she couldn't help crying. Don't cry, no one is laughing at you. Grandma, Axiu, you don't have to go to school tomorrow. We're almost out of food, so why should we read? Mr. Lin said angrily, tore the note in his hand to pieces, and walked out of the room, sighing and stamping his feet. However, not long after, Mr. Lin hurried back again, looked at Mrs. Lin's face and said, Where's the key on the cupboard door? Give me. Mrs. Lin's face immediately turned gray and she stared at her husband with her eyes wide open. She never let go. Her hiccups suddenly calmed down for a while. There is no other way but to go to those leisurely places in Zhaizhai. It's a ghost. Mr. Lin paused. He sighed, and then continued. I'll spend at most 400 yuan. If it's not enough for the party headquarters, I'll try not to do business and wait for them to close it. Yu Chengxiang, whom we met, bought more Japanese goods than me, a full 10,000 yuan. Even though the code cost a lot of money, it only cost 500 yuan. It would be peaceful. 500 yuan. It's like having a few bad debts. Key. Cough. That gold necklace can always be exchanged for 300 yuan. Really, like a robber. Mrs. Lin took out the key, her hands trembled, and tears fell down. Miss Lin stopped crying. Staring at a pair of tears, she was in a daze, and she vaguely saw the committee member who once came to her school to give a speech and stared at her like a hungry dog, a weird and annoying black pockmark, holding her house. Gold necklace jumping in midair. Open your mouth and smile. Then, she vaguely saw this gangster-like black pockmark arguing with her father, and her father was beaten by him. Ah! Miss Lin suddenly screamed and threw herself on her mother. Mrs. Lin was so panicked that she had no time to hiccup and struggle to say, Grandma. Don't cry, after the new year, your father will make new clothes for you if he has money, those cruel robbers. They all insist that we are rich, and losing money year after year. Your father's fertilizer business was deceived again, the store is all filled with other people's money. Grandma, I'm sick. You will suffer even while you are alive. Well, in 2 years, you will be 19 and you will find a good son-in-law. Well, I don't worry about dying. Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva who saves suffering. 2. The next day, Mr. Lin's shop had a new layout. The Japanese goods that had not been seen for nearly a week were once again placed in the most eye-catching position. Mr. Lin also imitated the method of big stores in Shanghai and wrote many red and green notes saying, 10% off big discounts, and pasted them on the glass windows. This day is the 23rd day of the 12th lunar month. It is the prosperous month for the rural Shenyang Guangdong store. Not only did Mr. Lin hope to get back his extra 400 yuan at this time, but Miss Lin's new clothes also depended on the good business these days. It's past 10 o'clock. Villagers on their way to market passed by in groups on the street. They held baskets on their arms or led children, talking loudly as they walked. When they saw Mr. Lin's colorful shop, they all stopped, raised their faces, and the wife called her husband. The children called them daddy and admired the goods. The new year is coming, the children hope to wear a new pair of socks, the women think that the basin at home has long been worn out, the face towel shared by the whole. The children called them daddy and admired the goods. The new year is coming, the children hope to wear a new pair of socks, the women think that the basin at home has long been worn out, the face towel shared by the whole family is still an old one from half a year ago, and the soap has been discontinued for more than a month. It's time to buy some while cheap stuff is on sale here. Mr. Lin sat on the counter, energized and smiling, looking at the country people and the 2 clerks and 2 apprentices in his shop, fully hoping that the goods would go out and the foreign money would come in. But these country people looked at it for a while, pointed and praised it for a while, and then lazily walked to Yu Chengxiang's shop across the door and stopped to look again. Mr. Lin stretched his neck and looked at the background of the country people, his eyes burning. He couldn't wait to bring them back. Dash. Aunt Lin, who was sitting next to the butterfly door that separated the store from the inner house, behind the counter, let out the she had barely held back for a long time. Miss Lin leaned against her mother's side and stared blankly at the street without making a sound. But her heart was pounding. She had already taken off at least half of her new clothes. Mr. Lin rushed to the counter and looked at his colleague Yu Chengxiang across the door with wide jealous eyes. The 4 or 5 clerks over there were lined up in front of the counter, waiting to do business. But none of the country people came to the counter. They looked at it for a while and then walked over. Mr. Lin felt relieved and couldn't help but smile at Yu Chengxiang's clerk. At this time, another group of 7 or 8 country people came to Mr. Lin's shop. One of them, a young man, actually took a step forward and tilted his head to look at the hanging umbrellas. Mr. Lin suddenly turned his face and his lips parted immediately. He personally solicited this expected customer. "Hey, brother, do you want to buy an umbrella? It's a bargain. An umbrella sells for 9 cents. Let's take a look at the goods." A waiter had already taken down 2 or 3 umbrellas, opened one immediately, and thrust it into the young countryman's hand. "Cheer up and use your exaggeration skills. Little master, look. It has a foreign satin face and a solid frame. It can withstand sunny weather or rain. Cheer up and use your exaggeration skills. Little master, look. It has a foreign satin face and a solid frame. It can withstand sunny weather or rain. It is durable and good-looking. 90 cents a foreign dollar a hat, it couldn't be cheaper. There is a foreign currency 1 hat over there, but the quality is not as good as this one, you will understand after comparing." The young countryman held an umbrella and opened his mouth as if he had no idea. He turned back to look at an old man in his 50s, and bumped the umbrella in his hand, as if to say, "Buy one?" But the old man shouted anxiously, "Dash. Ada. You fainted. I want to buy an umbrella. A boatload of firewood and an ancient brain sold for only more than 3 yuan. Your mother was waiting to measure the rice and go back to eat. How could she have the money to buy an umbrella? The goods are cheap, I don't have money to buy them." The country people standing there and watching sighed and walked away lazily. The young countryman's face flushed, he shook his head, put down his umbrella and was about to leave. This made Mr. Lin anxious, so he quickly gave in and asked, "Dash. Hey, brother, how much do you think it is? Take another look, the goods are reliable. The goods are cheap, but the money is not enough." The old man replied. He grabbed his son and ran away as if running away. Mr. Lin walked back to the counter with a grimace on his face, feeling uncomfortable all over. He knew that it wasn't that he didn't know how to do business, but that the people in the country were too poor and couldn't afford 90 cents for an umbrella. He glanced furtively at Yu Chengxiang across the door, but there were still only people standing there watching, and no one came to the counter to buy. At the Xingtai grocery store and Wanji cake shop next door to Yu Chengxiang, almost no one even looked at it. Groups of country people passing by carried baskets on their arms, but there was nothing in the baskets. Occasionally there was a package of floral blue cloth, which looked like rice. Even the late rice harvested by the country people more than a month ago has been exhausted by the landlords and loan sharks. Now the country people have to eat expensive rice in 1 or 2 liters. Mr. Lin understands all this. He felt that one of his businesses was at least indirectly deprived of him by landlords and loan sharks. The time is gradually approaching noon, and there are very few country people walking on the street. Mr. Lin's shop only does business worth more than 1 yuan. It was just enough to cover the advertising costs of the red and green paper strips with 10% discount on big discount photos. Mr. Lin walked into the inner house dejectedly, barely having the courage to meet his daughter and wife. Miss Lin had tears in her eyes and sat in the corner of the room with her head lowered. Amid a series of hiccups, Aunt Lin struggled and said to her husband, "I spent 400 yuan, and spent another whole night decorating it." Amid a series of hiccups, Aunt Lin struggled and said to her husband, "I spent 400 yuan, and spent another whole night decorating it." Well, the Japanese goods are definitely sold, but the business is slow. Grandma, Wuma has to get wages again. It's only half a day. Don't be anxious. Mr. Lin reluctantly comforted him, but the pain in his heart was worse than a knife. He took a few steps sullenly. I have thought about all the ways to promote my business, but I feel that none of them are the way to go. Business is slow, and it has been like this for a long time in all walks of life, not just his family. People are poor, but there is nothing they can do. But he still hopes that the afternoon business can be better. People in this town probably do their shopping in the afternoon. Don't they buy something for the new year? As long as they buy with intention, Mr. Lin's business is guaranteed. After all, his goods are cheaper than others. It is this hope that allows Mr. Lin to still sit at the counter with high energy and wait for his dream afternoon customers. This afternoon was obviously different from the morning. There were not many people on the street, but almost everyone knew each other. They can all be called by their names, or the names of their fathers and grandfathers. Mr. Lin leaned on the counter and greeted the locals who were walking and talking slowly past his shop with unusually gentle eyes. He often smiles and shouts to people who often do business. Hey, brother times, do you want to go to Qingfeng Pavilion for tea? The shop has a large display, let's do some trading. Sometimes the person being called actually stops and walks up to the counter. So Mr. Lin and his clerk were very busy, watching the eyes of this unknown customer very sensitively, and when they saw what goods his eyes glanced at, they quickly took out the goods and asked him to take the exam. Miss Lin stood by the pair of butterfly doors and was often called out by Mr. Lin to call the unknown customer uncle. The young apprentice brought a cup of tea and a small couplet of pearls. Mr. Lin also made special concessions on the price. When he met a customer who had to remove the last digit of about 10 cents, he took the abacus from the clerk's hand and counted for a while. Then he had to remove the last digit from the abacus and said with a smile, "It's really not original enough. But it's an old theme. I had no choice but to obey. Please do more business. I had no choice but to obey. Please do more business." The whole afternoon went by like this. There were about 10 transactions on cash and credit, large and small. Mr. Lin had already sweated through his cotton robe. Although he was so tired, Mr. Lin felt very happy. He glanced coldly at Yu Chengxiang, who was across the door, as if he couldn't keep up with the liveliness of his shop. Miss Lin, who often looked around the pair of butterfly doors, also had a smile on her face, and Aunt Lin also had to hiccup less. When it was almost time to turn on the lights, Mr. Lin calculated the days. The running account was equal to 0 in the morning, and it was sold for 16 yuan and 85 cents in the afternoon, and the 8 yuan was on credit. Mr. Lin smiled slightly, but immediately frowned. His big sale today was indeed sold according to the book, and the expenses were all he had no whereabouts, let alone official benefits. He stayed for a while. I opened the account box again, took out several account books, flipped through them, and did some calculations for a long time. I opened the account box again, took out several account books, flipped through them, and did some calculations for a long time. Mr. Lin sighed softly, feeling that if business is still not good after tomorrow, he will be a little sad at the end of the year. He looked at the red and green note on the glass window that read 10% off for big deals, and thought to himself, just do it like today. Business should always be good. Is it losing money? Even if there is no business, there will still be expenses. We have to attract some customers first and then slowly try to increase the number of goods. If there is wholesale business in Xixiang, that would be even better. Suddenly someone came to interrupt Mr. Lin's sweet dream. This was an old woman in her 50s who walked into the store tremblingly, holding a small blue cloth bag in her hand. Mr. Lin suddenly raised his head and came face to face with the old woman. He couldn't avoid it even if he wanted to, so he had to step forward and greet her. Mrs. Zhu Santa. Are you going out to buy New Year stuff? Please come inside and sit. Axu, come and help Mrs. Zhu. Miss Lin was no longer at the pair of butterfly doors and didn't hear it. Zhu Santai waved her hands repeatedly, sat on a chair in the shop, and solemnly opened her blue cloth handkerchief bag. There was only one discount in the bag. She held it with trembling hands and brought it directly to Mr. Lin's nose. She twisted her flat lips a few times and was about to speak. Mr. Lin had already taken the discount with one hand and said first at the same time. I understand. I'll deliver it to your house tomorrow. Oh. October, November, December, 1 is always 3 months, 3 is 9. Is it $9? You will deliver it tomorrow? Oh, don't give it away, let me take it. Mrs. Zhu twisted her pursed lips and said with difficulty. She has 300 yuan of old capital stored in Mr. Lin's shop. I come to collect 3 yuan of interest every month, but recently Mr. Lin has been in arrears for 3 months. It was originally said that the lump sum would be paid at the end of the year. Tomorrow is the stove gift day. The old lady wanted to buy things for the stove, so she came to Mr. Lin's shop in person. Judging from the way she twisted her pouty lips, she was definitely not willing to leave until she got the money. Mr. Lin scratched his scalp and remained silent. He had no intention of wasting the 9 yuan in interest, but his business had been slow for 3 months, and he only made enough money from his daily sales to buy food, pay taxes and duties, and unknowingly fell into arrears. However, if I don't pay today, the old woman might make a fuss in the shop, which would be too embarrassing and have a great impact on the future of the business. Okay, take it with you, take it with you. Mr. Lin finally said vindicatively. The voice was a little choked. He ran to the account counter, combined the cash from the morning and afternoon sales, and took out a pair of cents from his pocket. Then he made up the sum of 8 yuan, 10 jiao, and 40 coppers, and handed them to Mrs. Zhu Santai. When he saw the old woman solemnly counting the silver coins and wrapping them up in the blue cloth handkerchief, he couldn't help but sigh and whimsically planned to get back a few coins. Come, he forced a smile and said. 3 antai. Your blue cloth handkerchief is too old. Why don't you buy an old-fashioned linen white handkerchief? We have good hand towels and soap, buy some to use in the new year. The price is fair. No, I'm an old woman, I don't need it. Zhu Santai waved his hands repeatedly and said. He hid the fold in his pocket and walked away holding her blue cloth handkerchief. Mr. Lin walked back to the inner house with a sad face. Because Mrs. Zhu Santa came to ask for interest, he remembered that he still had 2 deposits, 200 yuan from Quodochin Laochi and 150 yuan from Widow Zhang. A total of about 10 yuan in interest was inconveniently owed and had to be sent in advance. He counted the days with his fingers, 24, 25, 26. By the 26th, all the accounts left in Xixiang should be collected. The Shoshing in the store went out to collect the accounts the day before yesterday. At the end of the day, 26 should be back. The town's accounts must be 28-9 before they have a number. However, the debt collector from Shanghai Haojia might arrive tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, so the only option is to borrow money from Hengyuan Bank. But what will the store sales be like tomorrow? As he walked with his head lowered, thinking, he suddenly heard his daughter's voice saying in his ear, Dad, what do you think of this big piece of silk? It's 7 feet, 4 yuan and 2 cents, isn't it expensive? Mr. Lin's heart suddenly jumped and he stood still with his eyes wide open and speechless. Miss Lin was holding the piece of silk in her hand, but she was smiling innocently. $4.02. The amount is really not that big, but today the total price in the store was just over 16 yuan, and it was honestly sold at a low price. Mr. Lin was stunned for a while, and then asked listlessly. Where did you get the money? Put it on the account. When Mr. Lin heard that he was in debt again, he couldn't help but frown. But he was used to doting on his daughter, and Mrs. Lin protected her to the death. Mr. Lin had no choice but to smile bitterly. After a while, he sighed and complained softly. So impatient. Wouldn't it be better to buy it after the Chinese New Year? 3. 2 days later, Mr. Lin's shop, which had a big sale, was doing very well. It could do more than 30 yuan of business a day. Mrs. Lin's hiccups were greatly reduced, with an average of it comes every 5 minutes. Miss Lin jumped in and out between the shop and the inner house. Her face was red and she was always smiling. Sometimes she would help greet business in the shop. It wasn't until Mrs. Lin called her again and again that she ran in, wiping the sweat on her forehead. Zhu, while excitedly said in a hurry. Mom. Why did you ask me to come in again? I don't feel like it's hard. Mom. Dad was so tired that he was covered in sweat and his voice was hoarse. A customer just bought something for 5 yuan. Mom. Don't be afraid of my hard work, don't be afraid. Dad told me to rest for a while and then go out. Mrs. Lin just nodded. When you say great merciful and great compassionate Bodhisattva. There was already a porcelain guanyin enshrined in the living room, and a stick of incense was lit. When you say great merciful and great compassionate Bodhisattva. There was already a porcelain guanyin enshrined in the living room, and a stick of incense was lit. Mrs. Lin waddled over and kowtowed, thanking the Bodhisattva for his blessing, and praying that the Bodhisattva would show mercy and bless Mr. Lin's business to always be so good. May Miss Lin grow up easily and get a good son-in-law next year. However, although Mr. Lin was busy doing business in the shop and kept smiling on his face, he felt like there were a few threads pulling him in his heart. Every time I get $1 from the sale, I see customers happily leaving with paper bags in hand. Mr. Lin couldn't help but feel sad, and added the loss of 5 cents of capital to his mental calculation. He tried several times to calculate the actual loss of every dollar in this big sale into 3 points, but no matter what, he always came up with 5 points. Although business was good, the more he sold, the more distressed he became. When greeting customers at the counter, his ambivalence sometimes almost made him dizzy. Occasionally, he glanced at Yu Chengxiang across the door, and felt that the clerk and shopkeeper were standing idle at the counter. There was a sarcastic smile on the corners of their mouths, as if they were saying, "Look at this fool surnamed Lin, he is really selling at a loss. Just look at it, the better his business is, the more money he will lose and the faster he will go bankrupt." At that time, Mr. Lin bit his lip. Decided to raise the goods code tomorrow no matter what, and mark second-class goods with the price of first-class goods. The president of the Chamber of Commerce, who was mediating the issue of sealing up Japanese goods for Mr. Lin, also smiled slightly and stopped to congratulate Mr. Lin when he passed by Lin's shop. And patted Mr. Lin on the shoulder and said softly, "How about it? 400 yuan is not wasted. But, you have to embellish Director Bu a little bit to prevent him from getting jealous and trying to blackmail you. If business is good, there will be more jealous people, that is, Director Bu is not angry." And patted Mr. Lin on the shoulder and said softly, "How about it? 400 yuan is not wasted. But, you have to embellish Director Bu a little bit to prevent him from getting jealous and trying to blackmail you. If business is good, there will be more jealous people, that is, Director Bu is not angry. They are going to stir up trouble too." Mr. Lin thanked the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce for his concern. He was so surprised that he almost had no energy to do business. They are going to stir up trouble too. Mr. Lin thanked the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce for his concern. He was so surprised that he almost had no energy to do business. But what made him most uneasy was that Shoshing in the store had gone out to collect the bill and had not returned yet. Mr. Lin was waiting for the money collected by Shoshing to pay his customer account. The bill collector from Shanghai Dongxing brand had already arrived in town the day before yesterday, and he was so pressed that Mr. Lin could no longer falter. If Shoshing never comes again, Mr. Lin's only option is to borrow money from Hengyuan Bank. Mr. Lin will have to bear an additional 50 or 60 yuan in interest. This is really more distressing for Mr. Lin, who is losing money than having his flesh cut off. At 4 o'clock, Mr. Lin suddenly heard people walking by on the street talking about something, and their faces were all anxious. It seems like something big happened. Mr. Lin, who was worried about the safety of Shosheng who was out to collect the bill, thought that the express boat must have been robbed by robbers, and his heart was beating wildly. He called a passerby and asked anxiously, "What's up? Was the Lisher Express train robbed by robbers? Oh. Was it another robbery? The road is really uneven. Robbery is a trivial matter, but why do you want to kidnap someone?" The man, the famous Xianhan monk Lu, answered vaguely, while staring at the colorful goods in Mr. Lin's shop with half an eye. Mr. Lin couldn't figure it out and became even more anxious. He left Monk Lu alone and went to ask the second person who approached, Wang Sanmao at the bridge. "I heard that Lisher's class was robbed. Are you serious? That must have been done by Taibao Oshu's men. Taibao Oshu was shot. How powerful his men were." Wang Sanmao answered and just walked away. But Mr. Lin was so anxious that cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had already estimated that Shoshing would come back today, and he would take a fast boat from Lisher, the last place scheduled for the collection process. It's already 4 o'clock now. He hasn't come yet. Wang Sanmao said that again. Is there any doubt? Mr. Lin actually forgot that the so-called Lisher class was robbed by robbers was his own invention. With sweat on his face, he ran straight to the inner house. He forgot to cross the threshold of the pair of butterfly doors. Almost stumbled. "Dad! There's a war in Shanghai. Japanese soldiers set bombs to burn Zhubei." Miss Lin shouted and ran to Mr. Lin. Mr. Lin was startled. The battle in Shanghai had nothing to do with him in the first place, but since the Japanese soldiers were involved, it seemed like I had to ask more questions. He looked at his daughter's excited face and asked, "Did the Japanese soldiers set off bombs? Where did you hear that?" "That's what everyone passing by on the street said. The Japanese soldiers fired artillery and threw bombs. Zhubei was burned down." "Oh, then. Did anyone say that Lisher Kuaiban was robbed by robbers?" Miss Lin shook her head and rushed outside like a moth to a flame. Mr. Lin hesitated for a while, then stood by the butterfly door and scratched his scalp. Aunt Lin hiccuped inside and murmured again, "Prayer, Bodhisattva bless you. Don't let the bomb fall on our heads." Mr. Lin turned around and went back to the shop, only to see his daughter and 2 clerks having a lively conversation. Jin Huahu, the owner of Xingtai grocery store opposite, was also standing outside the counter gesticulating and talking. The war in Shanghai. The Oriental planes dropped bombs and burned down Zhebei, and there was a market strike in Shanghai, which was all confirmed. Do robbers rob express ships? I've never heard anyone mention it. Is there an express bus from Lisher? We've arrived a long time ago. Have a safe journey. Golden Tiger saw the man on the express boat passing by carrying 2 cattail bags just now. Mr. Lin felt relieved, knowing that Shoshing did not come back today, but he also knew that he had not been robbed by robbers. Now the streets are full of talk about the war in Shanghai. The boys were in the middle of the commotion and yelled, "Oriental turtle." Some people actually shouted in the street. If you buy Japanese goods again, you will be forgetful. Miss Lin's face turned red as she listened. Mr. Lin, however, remained calm. Everyone was selling Japanese goods, and after spending hundreds of dollars, they all had a license. Just tear off the Japanese trademarks. Just go. All the goods in his store are now called domestic products, and the buyers all say, domestic products, and take them away. While everyone on the street was busy with the war in Shanghai and no longer thought about business, Mr. Lin was always thinking about his business. He still refused to spend a lot of money to borrow money from the bank, so he went to talk to the bill collector from Shanghai Hao family and asked him to wait for another day or two. His birthday will arrive as late as tomorrow evening. Boss Lin, you are also a sensible person. How could you say such a thing? Now that Shanghai is on fire, trains may not be available tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I really want to leave tonight. Why wait another day or two? Please pay the account in full today so that I can leave early tomorrow morning. I also eat other people's food, please take care of me. The Shanghai guest rejected Mr. Lin's emotional intelligence without mercy. Mr. Lin seemed to be unable to negotiate, so he had no choice but to go to Hengyuan Bank to negotiate a loan. He was also afraid that the money monkey would know that he was in urgent need of money and would take advantage of it to rob him and raise the interest rate. Unexpectedly, the bank manager's tone was completely wrong. After listening to Mr. Lin's application, the consumptive manager didn't answer. He just held his antique hookah and blew it until he finished burning a piece of paper and then said slowly, "No more." The Japanese soldiers started a war, the Shanghai market went on strike, and the banks were closed. You know when they will get it right. Once the road to Shanghai was cut off, our village became a crab without legs, and the bank transfers were blocked. No matter how good the account was at Bizunshu, we had no choice but to give it up. Sorry, I really can't help. The Japanese soldiers started a war, the Shanghai market went on strike, and the banks were closed. You know when they will get it right. Once the road to Shanghai was cut off, our village became a crab without legs, and the bank transfers were blocked. I always thought that this consumptive manager was deliberately making things difficult, just to increase the interest rate. I was about to say a few words of pleading, but unexpectedly, the manager pushed a step further and said, "We just gave the order, and with the letter he got, I'm afraid the trouble will be big this time. Tell us to tighten our plates. I originally owed 500, and on the 22nd, I owed another 100, for a total of 600. We must pay it all before the end of the year. We are also regular customers, so today we will send you a letter, so as not to waste time and save everyone's face. Embarrassed. Oh. But it's really difficult in the small shop. It depends on how the accounts are collected." Mr. Lin was stunned for a long time, and then he said these 2 sentences. "Hey. Why be so polite? The business in Baohao in the past few days has been extraordinary. It's only 600 yuan. Is it still embarrassing? I made it clear to my brother today. I hope everything will be cleared up, so I can explain it to you in front of me." The tuberculosis ghost manager said coldly and stood up. Mr. Lin was half cold. Seeing that the situation was irreversible, he had no choice but to bite the bullet and walked out of the bank. Only then did he realize that the war in Shanghai would also affect his small shop. This year's New Year's Eve is really sad. The debt collectors in Shanghai are pressing for money. Hengyuan is not allowed to stay for the new year. Shoshing hasn't come back yet. I know what happened to him, the town's accounts. Last year he only collected 80%, but this year it seems that even 80% is not secure. The road ahead of him is just one: suspend business and clean up the accounts. And this road is equivalent to bankruptcy. He has no capital of his own in this shop. Once it is liquidated, what will be left for him? The situation was just a family of 3 and 3 naked people. The more Mr. Lin thought about it, the more he became confused. When he walked across the Wangxian Bridge, he looked at the muddy water under the bridge and almost wanted to jump. But there was a person calling him from behind. "Mr. Lin, is it true that there is a war in Shanghai?" I heard that a troop of soldiers had just been transferred from outside Dongzha, and they went to the Chamber of Commerce to ask for their pay. The asking price was 20,000 yuan. There was a meeting in the Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Lin hurriedly turned around and saw that it was Chen Laochi who had saved 200 yuan in his shop. He is also one of Mr. Lin's creditors. Oh. Mr. Lin froze for a moment, only answered this, then quickly got off the bridge and ran home in one breath. 4. For dinner this evening, in addition to the usual meat and vegetables, Mrs. Lin also added an extra plate. It's the braised pork bought at Baxianlo, Mr. Lin's favorite thing. There is also a pound of rice wine. Miss Lin couldn't stop laughing, because the shop was doing well, because the new silk cheongsam had been made, and because Shanghai actually opened fire on the Japanese. Aunt Lin's hiccups became even less frequent, coming only once every 10 minutes. Only Mr. Lin felt depressed to death. He drank sullenly, looked at his daughter, and then at his wife. He wanted to announce the bad news like a bomb several times, but finally did not have the courage. And he wasn't desperate yet, he still wanted to struggle, at least to cover up that he couldn't hit his head in 2 strokes. So when the Chamber of Commerce agreed to borrow 5,000 yuan and asked Mr. Lin to contribute 20 yuan, he agreed without any hesitation. He decided not to let his wife and daughter know the true situation of the family's financial difficulties until the last 5 minutes. His bargain was this: he would charge 80% of the debt owed to him, and he would pay 80% of the debt owed to him anyway. He could use the excuse that there was a war in Shanghai and the banks were blocked. The embarrassing thing is that there is still a gap of 600 years between what I owe and what I owe, so I can only use the method of cutting out flesh to mend the sores and sell cheap stuff, and make a few money to get by. Who can take care of the future these days? Muddling along for the moment. That's how I figured it out. Coupled with the power of the pound of rice wine, Mr. Lin slept soundly all night without any nightmares. The next morning, coupled with the power of the pound of rice wine, Mr. Lin slept soundly all night without any nightmares. The next morning, it was already 6:30 when Mr. Lin woke up, and the sky was very gloomy. Mr. Lin felt a little dizzy. He hurriedly swallowed 2 bowls of porridge. As soon as I got to the shop, I saw the Shanghainese customer sitting there with a serious face and answering questions. What particularly surprised Mr. Lin was that Yu Changxiang, diagonally across the door, also posted a red and green note, offering a 10% off discount on large sales. Mr. Lin's wishful thinking last night was immediately shaken by the red and green notes diagonally across the door. Boss Lin, you are really joking. You didn't reply to me last night. The ship leaves at 8 o'clock, and I have to transfer to the train. I have to take the 8 o'clock ship. Please hurry up. The Shanghai guest said impatiently and put his fist on the table. Mr. Lin can only accompany you. Please forgive him. It is because the bank in Shanghai is not connected, and both of them have been regular customers for many years. Please pay special attention to Cheng. You want me to go back empty-handed? This definitely won't happen. As soon as our longevity student comes back, he will pay as much as he has. If I hide half of the money, I am not a human being. Mr. Lin said with a trembling voice, trying hard to hold back the tears rolling to his eyes. At the end of his words, the Shanghai guest had no choice but to stop talking. But he sat there and refused to leave. Mr. Lin seemed anxious, and his heart was beating wildly. Although he has been extremely poor in recent years, he has been able to keep up his reputation. Now that he has a person sitting in the shop, if this matter spreads, his credibility will be ruined. He still has a lot of debtors, and if others follow suit, his shop will have to close down immediately. He thought of a way out of his desperation and invited the debt collector to sit in his inner house several times, but the debt collector refused. Freezing rain fell again. One street was deserted and almost deserted. Since the establishment of this street, I have never seen such a desolate end of the year. The early wind blew the signboards, making a rustling sound. Gradually the freezing rain turned into snowflakes again. The guys in the shops along the street leaned on the counter and raised their faces in confusion. Mr. Lin and the bill collector chatted without a word. Miss Lin suddenly walked out of the butterfly door and stood on the street looking at the freezing rain. Aunt Lin's hiccups, which came from behind the butterfly door, gradually became louder and louder. Mr. Lin was socializing while looking at his daughter and listening to his wife's hiccups. His heart felt sour for a while, thinking that his life was completely unhappy. However, he didn't know who it was that had tricked him to this extent. The Shanghai guest seemed to have calmed down a bit, and suddenly said sincerely, "Boss Lin, you are a good person. You have no hobbies at all, and you are very flattering and serious in doing business. 20 years ago, were you afraid that you would not get rich? But the current situation is different. Taxes are heavy, expenses are high, and business is clean. It's still up to you to get by. But the current situation is different. Taxes are heavy, expenses are high, and business is clean. It's still up to you to get by. Mr. Lin sighed and smiled bitterly, which was considered modest. The Shanghai guest paused, and then continued. The market in your town is worse this year than last year. Yes or no? The mainland relies entirely on village business, and the country people are so poor that they really have no choice. Oh, it's 9 o'clock. Why hasn't your bill collection guy arrived yet? Is this person reliable? Mr. Lin's heart skipped a beat and he couldn't answer for the time being. Although he is an old friend of 7 or 8 years. Nothing has ever gone wrong, but who can guarantee the end? What's more, he didn't come back after the expiration date. The Shanghai guests looked at Mr. Lin's hesitant look and laughed. The laughter was a bit strange. Suddenly Miss Lin over there turned to Mr. Lin and shouted hurriedly. Dad. Shoshing is back. Covered in mud. Apparently Miss Lin's cry was also strange. Mr. Lin jumped up, surprised and happy, and wanted to run to the counter anxiously to take a look, but he panicked and his legs became weak. At this time, Shoshing had already ran in. Shoshing is back. Covered in mud. Apparently Miss Lin's cry was also strange. Mr. Lin jumped up, surprised and happy, and wanted to run to the counter anxiously to take a look, but he panicked and his legs became weak. At this time, Shoshing had already ran in, really covered in mud. He sat down panting, speechless. Mr. Lin guessed that something was wrong, so he was so frightened that he had no idea and did not speak. The Shanghai guests frowned nearby. After a while, Shoshing gasped and said, Dash. It's so dangerous. I almost got caught by them. Did the robbers rob the express boat? Mr. Lin was so shocked that he was so heartbroken that he was forced to speak. It's not a robber. It's the army RAF. I couldn't catch the express class yesterday afternoon. I took advantage of the boat early this morning, but I didn't know that the boat heard that there was a plan to capture the boat, so it stopped outside the east gate. I walked ashore less than half a mile when I met RAF. A Mayo from Baoxian clothing store in the west was taken away by them. I ran fast and took a small path to escape. Damn it, lives are at stake. Shoshing said as he lifted up his clothes. He took out a handkerchief bag from his belly pocket and handed it to Mr. Lin, and then said. They're all here. The Huang Maoji store in Lishur is abominable. We should pay attention to this kind of account next year. I'm going to wash my face and change clothes and come back. Mr. Lin took the hand towel bag and squeezed it. There was a smile on his face. He went to the counter and opened the bag of handkerchiefs. First, I took a look at the list, did some calculations, and then checked the amount of money. It was 11 yuan, 200 yuan, 420 yuan in banknotes, plus 2 bankers' bills at sight. One is for 50 taels of Gui yuan, and the other is for 65 taels of Gui yuan. All this was paid to the Shanghai guests, and according to the calculation, there was still a shortfall of more than 100 yuan. Mr. Lin thought for a long time, glanced sideways at the Shanghainese guests sitting there smoking several times, and then sighed. He picked up the 2 banknotes and the 400 yuan banknote as if cutting meat and held them up to the Shanghai guest. After saying a lot more, the Shanghai guest nodded and said, That's right. But the Shanghai guest looked at the banker's ticket twice and suddenly said with a smile, Dash. I'm sorry, Boss Lin. This banknote, please go to the trouble of cashing it and give it to me. Okay. Mr. Lin replied quickly, hurriedly stamped the store's signature on the back of the banknote, sent a clerk to Henyuan village to withdraw cash, and asked for banknotes. After another long while, the clerk came back empty-handed. Hengi Wanzwang took the note but refused to pay. It was said that it deducted the amount owed by Mr. Lin. It was really snowing, and Mr. Lin didn't even open an umbrella. He braved the snow to go to Henyuan village to negotiate in person, but the result was in vain. Boss Lin, what's going on? Seeing Mr. Lin running back with a grimace, the Shanghai guest asked impatiently. Mr. Lin almost wanted to cry. He had no words to answer and just sighed. Besides begging the Shanghai guest to be more accommodating, is there any other way? Shoshing also came and helped Mr. Lin. They vowed that the more than 200 yuan they owed would be remitted to Shanghai on the 10th day of the Lunar New Year next year. He is an old customer. He has always settled his accounts in 3 quarters and never said a word. Today is really an unexpected change. The overall situation is like this. There is no way. It is not because of their unfaithfulness. But don't add any more. It won't work after all. Mr. Lin could not bear to collect the cash from the sales in the past few days and collected 50 yuan. He paid a total of 450 yuan before sending away the troublesome Shanghai bill collector. It was already 11 o'clock. The sky is still fluttering with snow. There are no buyers. Mr. Lin was puzzled for a while, and discussed with Shouxing how to collect the accounts of this street. Both of them frowned, and both felt that the town was really unsure of how to close its account of more than 600 yuan. Shouxing whispered into Mr. Lin's ear. I heard that Jilong in Nansha and Heyuan in Shizha are not stable. These two places owe us 300 years. Shouxing whispered into Mr. Lin's ear. I heard that Jilong in Nansha and Heyuan in Shizha are not stable. These two places owe us 300 years. We must be on guard against these two debts in advance. If we eat them, it is not a joke. Mr. Lin's expression changed. Lips tremble a little. Unexpectedly, Shouxing lowered his voice even lower and stammered even more shocking news. Also, there are nasty rumors about our place. The master of Hengyuan village must have heard these rumors, and that's why he was so anxious about us. Maybe the bill collectors in Shanghai also know a little bit about it, but who is against us? Is it just diagonally opposite the door? As Shouxing spoke, he sipped toward Yu Chengxiang. Mr. Lin's eyes followed Shouxing's mouth and glanced that way. My heart was beating wildly, I was crying, and I was speechless for a long time. His numb and painful heart felt that this time he must be ruined. He is the one who makes trouble if he does not destroy him, the party boss blackmails him, the bank oppresses him, his colleagues slander him, and he will suffer the consequences. No one can bear such heavy torture. And for what reason should he suffer? He inherited this small shop from his father and never dared to waste it. He was so fawning in business. He had never harmed anyone or had any evil intentions. He was his ancestor. I haven't harmed anyone or done anything bad. However, his life has been so miserable. But, master, just let them spread rumors and don't panic. Rumors are spreading in the famine years. I heard that 9 out of 10 shops in the town cannot celebrate the new year. The current situation is not good and the market is extremely clean. The store that has always been tough is facing a famine this year, so it's not a problem for our family. If the sky falls on everyone, the Chamber of Commerce must find a way to come up with it. We cannot bring it down all at once, making the market even less like a market. Seeing that Mr. Lin was in distress, Shouxing comforted him temporarily. Couldn't help but sigh. The snow is getting thicker and thicker, and the streets are already turning white. Occasionally, a dog walks by with its tail hanging down. It shakes its body and shakes off the snow thickly accumulated on its fur, and then quietly walks away with its tail between its legs. Ever since this street existed, I have never seen such a desolate New Year's Eve. At this time, far away in Shanghai, Japanese heavy artillery was frantically destroying the bustling shops there. 5. The desolate New Year has finally passed. 28 shops, large and small, closed down in the town. There is a Jilong and Heyuan, a silk shop with a high reputation, finally collapsed. During the day of New Year's Eve, Shouxing went to the two shops for a long time and only took $2. More than 10 yuan. After that, I heard that no bill collector got half a penny. The owners of both shops avoided meeting each other. As for Mr. Lin himself, thanks to the mediation of the Chamber of Commerce chairman, he does not need to hide in the countryside. However, the more than 400 yuan he owes to Hengyuan Bank must be paid off before the 15th day of the first lunar month, and he has also set harsh conditions. From the day the market opens on the 5th day of the first lunar month, Hengyuan will send people to Mr. Lin's shop to keep the money, and 80% of the money sold will be deducted from Hengyuan. During the 4 days of the new year, Mr. Lin's house was like an ice cellar. Mr. Lin sighed often, and Mrs. Lin's hiccups were like a volley of burps. Although Miss Lin didn't hiccup or sigh, she looked as if she had been suffering from a yellow disease for many years. Although Miss Lin didn't hiccup or sigh, she looked as if she had been suffering from a yellow disease for many years. Her new silk cheongsam had been pawnshop to pay Mother Wu's wages. The little apprentice had been waiting in front of the only pawn shop since 7 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't until 9 o'clock that I took 2 yuan from the crowd and squeezed it out. From now on, pawn shops will stop being pawn shops. $2. This is already the highest price. No matter how much valuable clothing you have, you can only get 2 pieces. It's called $2 to seal the door. The countryman endured the cold and peeled off his cotton-padded jacket and handed it to the counter. The pawn shop boy picked it up, shook it, threw it out, and shouted angrily, "Inappropriate. Starting from New Year's Day, it will be a nice sunny day." The empty field in front of Guandi Temple. As usual, the vendors and jugglers who came to catch up on the New Year business came. People dragged their legs lazily in front of those stalls, holding their empty pockets with both hands, and walked away lazily. The children grabbed the mother's clothes and stayed in front of the fireworks stall, refusing to leave. Mom gave him a slap in the face. Those street vendors who came especially to celebrate the new year couldn't even afford food, so they stayed in the Anshan guest house and quarreled with the owner of the guest house every day. Only the jugglers made a big business of $8. The party bosses called them to embellish the atmosphere of prosperity. On the night of the 4th day of the Lunar New Year, Mr. Lin barely raised 3 yuan to hold a banquet and treat the good friends in the shop to the usual 5-road wine and discuss ways to open the market tomorrow. Mr. Lin has already thought about it thoroughly. As long as this shop is open, it will be a loss-making business. If it doesn't open, his family of 3 will have no livelihood. Moreover, they still owe him 400 to 500 yuan for goods. It will be even harder for him to collect it once it closes. The only way is reduce expenses. But taxes and salaries cannot be avoided, and blackmail especially cannot be avoided. Let's just lay off 1 or 2 clerks. Originally, he only had 3 clerks. Shousheng was his right-hand man, and the other 2 were very pitiful. Besides, it would be hard to quit even after they quit. Not enough to attract business. What about home? There is nothing to worry about anymore. Wu Ma has already resigned. He felt that he could make up for his shortcomings if he just had to keep going, or rely on the blessing of bodhisattvas to make the country people spring silkworms mature. But the biggest difficulty in opening the market is the lack of goods. There is no cash to send to Shanghai. Can't get the goods. The fight in Shanghai is getting worse, so there is no need to think about credit. After selling off the bottom products, his store has long been sold out, and the cartons containing sanitary robes on the shelves are empty, but they are just there as a pretense. There were only some daily groceries left in his shop. Wash basin towels and the like are quite thick. Everyone drank for a while and scratched their cheeks and ears, unable to come up with any good ideas. Later, when we were talking about Xiantian, a waiter suddenly said, "In these troubled times, people are no match for dogs. I heard that Zhebei, Shanghai, was burned to the ground. Hundreds of thousands of people escaped naked. In the Hongkou area, even though the fire had not yet started, everyone had fled. Hundreds of thousands of people escaped naked. In the Hongkou area, even though the fire had not yet started, everyone had fled. The Japanese were very fierce and were not allowed to move anything. Housing prices in Shanghai have increased several times. The people who escaped have all come to the countryside, and a group of them arrived in the town yesterday. They seem to be from good families, but now they are homeless." Mr. Lin shook his head and sighed. After hearing this, Shousheng suddenly thought of a good idea. He put down his chopsticks, picked up the wine glass and drank it all in one gulp. He smiled and said to Mr. Lin, "Master, do you hear what Asi said? Our wash basins, towels, soap, socks, tooth powder, and toothbrushes can all be sold off." Mr. Lin stared, not understanding what Shousheng meant. "Master, this is a great opportunity. People who escape from Shanghai. Do you hear what Asi said? Our wash basins, towels, soap, socks, tooth powder, and toothbrushes can all be sold off." Mr. Lin stared, not understanding what Shousheng meant. "Master, this is a great opportunity. They always have to buy some daily necessities, right? Let's get this business done as soon as possible." Shousheng continued. He sifted out another glass of wine and drank it, his face full of joy. The 2 guys also realized it and laughed. Only Mr. Lin didn't understand it very well. Recent adversity has turned him into confusion. He asked in confusion, "Are you able to hold it steady? There are wash basins and towels at other places, too." "Master, you forgot. We are the only ones who have a lot of things like wash basins and towels. Yuchang Xiangli can't afford 10 wash basins, and they only pick up leftovers. This business cannot escape our hands." We quickly wrote a few more advertisements and distributed them in Sitsa, where the refugees lived. Hey, see, where did they live? We also need to put up advertisements. Some of them have relatives and live with their relatives, and some of them don't. He also borrowed an empty house in the cocoon factory outside Shizha. The guy named Asi replied, his face lit up. He was very proud that he had unintentionally made a great contribution. Mr. Lin also completely understood it at this time. As soon as he felt happy, he became flexible again, and he immediately drafted the advertisement. Manuscript. I specially selected the daily necessities available in the store and listed them. There are about a dozen types. He also imitated the method of selling 1 yuan goods in big stores in Shanghai. He put a wash basin, towel, toothbrush, and tooth powder into a set and sold them for 1 yuan. The advertisement read, "Big cheap 1 yuan goods." There was some red and green paper left in the store, so Shousheng cut it into a big sheet and started writing with a pen. The 2 waiters and the apprentice hurriedly took the wash basin, towel, toothbrush, and tooth powder to assemble it into a set. There was not enough manpower, so Mr. Lin asked his daughter to come out and help with writing and tying. In addition, there are several kinds of 1 yuan goods, all of which are scattered daily necessities. That night, the Lin family shop was busy until about 5 o'clock, and it was almost ready. Early the next morning, firecrackers went off when the door opened, the row of doors opened, and the Lin's shop was decorated again. The advertisements that were late at night have already been posted separately. Shousheng personally arranged the cocoon factory area outside Shizha, coaxing the refugees living in the cocoon factory to get up and watch it, treating it as a piece of news. In the inner house, Aunt Lin also woke up at midnight. Incense was lit in front of porcelain guanyin, and Mrs. Lin crawled and kowtowed for a long time. She prayed for everything except praying to the Bodhisattva that the war in Shanghai would expand and be prolonged and that more people would flee. Everything went smoothly, and everything went beyond Shousheng's expectations. On the first day that the new market opened, only Lin's shop was doing very well. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it sold for more than 100 yuan, which was a new record that had not been seen in this town in the past 10 years. The bulk of the sales were indeed 1 yuan goods, but umbrellas, rubber rain boots and the like also generated sales. And the business was done very well. Although they are refugees, they live in Shanghai after all and have seen big events. They are not as petty as country people or local people. They buy things easily. They pick up the goods and take a look. They never trade with cash. Picking and picking. Don't insist on cutting off the odds. When Mrs. Lin saw her daughter running in happily and boasting, she climbed up to the porcelain guanyin and kowtowed. She also had this thought in her mind: if the age difference wasn't so different, it would be a good idea to recruit Shousheng as her son-in-law. Maybe Shousheng would often look at this familiar 17-year-old junior sister with half an eye. There was only one thing that disappointed Mr. Lin. Hengyuan village sent someone to withdraw 80% of the day's total business without any regard for face. And the depositor is Zhu Sanatai. Quoto Chen Laoqi and Widow Zhang, I don't know who listened to the instigation. They all use the excuse of measuring rice to eat to advance interest, not only to pay interest, but also to withdraw some savings. Quoto Chen Laoqi and Widow Zhang, I don't know who listened to the instigation. They all use the excuse of measuring rice to eat to advance interest, not only to pay interest, but also to withdraw some savings. But there is also good news. I heard that another group of refugees have arrived. At dinner, Mr. Lin added 2 plates of meat dishes to reward his waiter. Everyone praised Shousheng for his ability. Although Mr. Lin was happy, he couldn't help but worry about the fact that the 3 depositors, including Zhu San and Mrs. Zhu, wanted to withdraw their deposits. It is always unlucky to encounter this kind of thing during the new year. Shousheng said angrily. What do those 3 know? It's not like someone is provoking it. As he spoke, Shousheng sipped diagonally towards the door again. Mr. Lin nodded. But these 3 people didn't know anything, so it was difficult to deal with them. One was an old man, and the 2 were lonely women. To put it mildly, refuse. It's impossible to force yourself to do it. After thinking for a long time, Mr. Lin decided that the only option was to go to the president of the Chamber of Commerce and ask him to talk to the 3 treasures. He told Shousheng about it, and Shousheng also strongly agreed. So after dinner, after calculating the day's running accounts, Mr. Lin went to visit the president of the Chamber of Commerce. After Mr. Lin explained his intention, the president of the Chamber of Commerce agreed immediately and praised Mr. Lin for his excellent business skills. His shop would definitely be able to stand up and make progress. Touching his chin, the Chamber of Commerce president smiled again, leaned over and said, There's one thing I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but I just didn't have the chance. Director Bu in the town had seen your lady come somewhere, and he was very fond of her. Director Bu was almost 40 years old and had no son yet. Although there were 2 people in the house, neither of them had given birth. If Ling Ai came and gave birth to a boy and a half, female, she is the ready-made wife of the director. Oh, at that time, even I had some light. Mr. Lin never dreamed that there would be such a problem, and he was stunned and speechless. But the president of the Chamber of Commerce continued solemnly. We are old friends, and we can explain everything clearly. When it comes to this kind of thing, according to the old school, it seems that it doesn't look good on face, but that's not necessarily the case. This is the current practice, and your wife was considered right in the past. Besides, since Director Bu has this intention, there will be a lot of inconvenience if he doesn't agree. If he agrees, he will have hope in the future. I said this because I had plans for you. Ahem, I'm afraid you don't mean well to advise me to be careful. However, I come from a small family and my daughter doesn't understand the rules. I really don't dare to go up to Director Bu. Mr. Lin said bravely, his heart pounding wildly. Ha, ha, it's not you who wants it, it's him who likes it. That's it. You go back and discuss it with Madam. I'll leave it here. When you see Director Boo, just say that you haven't had a chance to mention it yet, okay? That's it. You go back and discuss it with Madam. I'll leave it here. When you see Director Boo, just say that you haven't had a chance to mention it yet, okay? But you have to give me a reply soon. Well. After thinking for a long time, Mr. Lin reluctantly responded, with a dead look on his face. Back home. Mr. Lin put his daughter away and told Mrs. Lin everything. Before he could finish speaking, Mrs. Lin started to scream loudly, and even the neighbors could hear her clearly. She barely suppressed the ughs that came over her, and gasped, How can I agree, I'm not a little wife, I can't bear to see Axiu become someone else's wife. That's what I mean too, but, we do business in a disciplined manner. Don't we agree that he can rob us? But he must come to cause trouble. This kind of person is more cruel than a robber. Mr. Lin whispered, almost crying. I risked my life. Ugh. Save the suffering, Guanyin. Mrs. Lin stood up with a trembling voice, swaying and wanting to leave. Mr. Lin quickly stopped him and shouted silently. Where to go? Where to go? At the same time, Miss Lin also came from outside the room. She had obviously heard something. Her face was gray and her eyes were staring. When Mrs. Lin saw her daughter, she hugged her. While crying and hiccuping, she murmured, struggling and gasping for air, Grandma, who's going to rob you, I will fight for my life with him. I got this disease when I was born, I managed to survive until I was 17, I died at the same time. Well, it's great to have given it to Shousheng earlier. Well. Robber. Don't be afraid of God's beating. Miss Lin also cried, shouting, Mom. Mr. Lin rubbed his hands and sighed. Seeing that the crying was not appropriate, the narrow house and the shallow house would alarm the neighbors, and the new year was also unlucky, so he had to endure his anger to persuade the mother and daughter. That night, none of the 3 members of the Lin family slept well. Mr. Lin will still have to do business early tomorrow morning. In the night of wandering and thinking, he occasionally heard a sound on the roof, and his heart started to beat wildly, thinking that Director Boo was coming to cause trouble for him. However, when he calmed down and thought about it carefully, he realized that his house was well behaved. Businessmen are not breaking the law, as long as the business is good. If you don't owe someone money, why do you want to cause trouble for no reason and deceive him for nothing? As for his business, there is clearly a glimmer of hope ahead. After giving birth to a daughter, she looks decent, but she is going to cause trouble. If we had arranged the engagement earlier, maybe this mistake wouldn't have happened? Is the president of the Chamber of Commerce really willing to help? He could only plead with him to try something, but Mrs. Lin was hiccuping again, she is sick. As soon as the sky turned white, Mr. Lin stood up. His eye circles were a little red and swollen, and his head felt dizzy. But he had to cheer up and greet business. It's really not possible to live a life of longevity in a shop. This young man has been tired enough in recent days. Mr. Lin sat at the counter, feeling uncertain. Although business was good, his whole body was shaking from time to time. When he saw the old man coming up to buy something, he suspected that he was someone sent by Director Boo to spy on him and stir up trouble. His heart beat painfully. But he also acted strangely. Business was surprisingly good that day. By noon, it had been sold for 50 or 60 yuan, and some of the buyers were from this town. It didn't feel like buying something, it just felt like robbing something. This situation only occurs when a shop closes down and auctions off its stock. Mr. Lin was a little happy, but at the same time he was frightened. He thought that such a good business does not look good. Sure enough, during lunch, Shousheng quietly told. There are rumors again outside. It is said that you demolished the trash and sold a batch of cheap goods. After making a few money, you plan to run away. Mr. Lin was so angry and scared that he couldn't speak. Suddenly 2 men in uniforms came and barged in and asked. Who is Boss Lin? Mr. Lin stood up in a hurry and didn't answer yet. 2 men in uniform grabbed him and left. Shousheng chased after him, wanting to stop him, but also wanting to inquire. The 2 men shouted loudly, Who are you? Get out of here. The party headquarters wants to question him. 6. That afternoon, Mr. Lin did not come back. The store is busy. Shousheng couldn't spare the time to inquire by himself. Inside, Aunt Lin was still being kept secret, but unexpectedly the apprentice leaked the information, and Aunt Lin almost died in one breath due to her panic. She refused to let Miss Lin out of the pair of butterfly doors, saying, Your father has been captured by them, and they will come to snatch you back. She only asked Shouxing to come in and ask for details. Seeing the situation, Shouxing couldn't speak directly, so he only said a few words of vague comfort. Master, don't be anxious, it's okay. The master went to the party headquarters to sort out the deposits. Our business is good, so what are we afraid of? Turning his back to Mrs. Lin, Shouxing quietly told Miss Lin, why, we haven't got any accurate information yet. He told Miss Lin to stay with Master's wife, with peace of mind. He was there for the outside world. Lin. The young lady has no idea at all, Shouxing said. She just nodded. In this way, he has to attract outside business and find words to deal with Aunt Lin's constant inquiries. Shouxing has no time to find out Mr. Lin's whereabouts. It wasn't until it was time to turn on the lights that the president of the Chamber of Commerce gave him a letter. Mr. Lin was detained by the party because there were rumors that Mr. Lin planned to escape with the money. However, in addition to the bank account and unpaid customer accounts, Mr. Lin also had Mrs. Zhu San, Quoto Chen Laoqi, and widow Zhang San. The orphan's savings totaling 650 yuan are not guaranteed. The party headquarters was specifically looking for benefits for these lonely people, so they detained Mr. Lin and asked him to straighten out these deposits. Shouxing was so frightened that his face turned yellow. He was stunned for a long time and then asked, bail the people out first, okay? The party headquarters was specifically looking for benefits for these lonely people, so they detained Mr. Lin and asked him to straighten out these deposits. Shouxing was so frightened that his face turned yellow. He was stunned for a long time and then asked, bail the people out first, okay? If the people don't come out, where will we get the money? Hey! Save someone. If you go empty-handed, do you want to protect me? Mr. President, I always ask you to think of ways to do good things. Master and you have always been on good terms with each other. I always ask you to do good things. If you go empty-handed, do you want to protect me? Mr. President, I always ask you to think of ways to do good things. Master and you have always been on good terms with each other. I always ask you to do good things. The president of the Chamber of Commerce frowned and pondered for a while, and then looked at Shouxing for a while. Then a Shou came to the corner of the room and whispered, there's no reason for me to stand by and watch your master's affairs. It's just that this matter is now deadlocked. To be honest with you, I beg Director Bu to intercede. Director Bu only needs your master to agree to one thing, and he is willing to help. Then a Shou came to the corner of the room and whispered, there's no reason for me to stand by and watch your master's affairs. It's just that this matter is now deadlocked. To be honest with you, I beg Director Bu to intercede. Director Bu only needs your master to agree to one thing, and he is willing to help. I just went to the party headquarters to meet with your master and persuaded him to agree, and he agreed. Isn't that the end of the matter? Unexpectedly, that black pockmarked man in the party headquarters is really hateful. He refuses to. Don't he give Director Bu face? That's right. Instead, Hey Matzi talked a lot. Director Bu could hardly step down. The two had a falling out. Isn't this what made it so stiff? Shouxing sighed and had no idea. After a pause, he sighed again and said, but the master has not committed any crime. They don't want to reason with you. Whoever has power is justified. Go and tell Mrs. Lin, don't worry, you haven't suffered yet, but you have to spend some money to figure it out. The president of the Chamber of Commerce said, raised 2 fingers, and hurried away. Shouxing pondered, without any idea. 2 guys stopped him to ask, but he didn't answer. The president of the Chamber of Commerce said these words. Can you tell teacher's wife? Have to spend money again. He didn't know if teacher's wife had any personal savings. As for the store, he knew very well that Heng Yuan had withdrawn 80% of the cash from the sales in the past 2 days, leaving only more than 50 yuan, so what kind of help was there? The president of the Chamber of Commerce indicated that the total would be 200. Is it enough to know? If this continues, it will be useless no matter how good the business is. He felt a little discouraged. They're calling him again. He had no choice but to go in and take a look at the scene before making up his mind. Aunt Lin held her daughter's shoulders and asked breathlessly, just now, the president of the Chamber of Commerce is here, what do you say? Not coming. Shouxing told a lie. You don't have to hide it from me, I know everything, your face turned yellow with fear. Xiu saw it, Don't worry, master, the president of the Chamber of Commerce said it doesn't matter. Director Bu is willing to help. What? A what? Director Bu is willing to help. The great merciful and compassionate Bodhisattva, don't ask for his help. I know, your master, is dead. I don't want to live anymore either. It's just that Axiu, I can't worry about it. You went with her. Be a good person. Shousheng, if you treat Axie well, I will feel relieved. Go ahead. They're coming to snatch it. Ugh, cruel robber. Why doesn't Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva appear? Shousheng opened his eyes wide and didn't know how to reply. He thought Master's wife was crazy, but she was not crazy at all. He peeked at his junior sister. Her heart was beating a little. Miss Lin's face turned red. She lowered her head and remained silent. Brother Shousheng, someone is looking to talk to you. The young apprentice came in jumping all the way. Shousheng ran out in a hurry, always thinking that the president of the Chamber of Commerce or something was coming again. Who knew it was Mr. Wu, the shopkeeper of Yuchangxiang across the street? What is he here for? Shousheng thought, his eyes fixed on Mr. Wu's face. After Mr. Wu asked about Mr. Lin's news, he smiled and said, "It doesn't matter." Shousheng felt that the smiling face was a bit strange. "I came to you to make some deals." Mr. Wu stopped smiling, suddenly changed his tone, and took out a piece of paper from his sleeve. It was a horizontal slip with more than 10 lines written on it. It was Lin. All the 1 yuan goods that Mr. Shousheng was selling were immediately understood by him. It turned out to be this trick. He immediately said, "Master is not here, I can't make the decision." "You told your wife, it's not the same." Shousheng hesitated and could not answer. He now somewhat understood why Mr. Lin was arrested. First, it was rumored that Mr. Lin wanted to escape, and secondly, Mr. Lin was detained. But now it was Yuchangxiang who came to dig up the goods, and the series of clues were all clear. Shousheng was a little angry and a little scared when he thought about it. He knew very well that if he agreed to Mr. Wu's request, then Mr. Lin's business and all his hard work would be over. But he didn't agree. He simply didn't dare think about what other tricks he could do. Finally, he gave it a try and said, "Then, I'll go tell my wife, but my wife specializes in cash transactions." "Cash money? Ha, Shousheng, are you joking? Master's wife has this kind of temper, and I can't help it. It's best to wait until tomorrow to talk about it. The president of the Chamber of Commerce said just now that Director Bu is willing to help negotiate, and Master Guangjing can come back tonight." Shousheng said deliberately coldly, and put the horizontal slip back into Mr. Wu's hand. The flesh on Mr. Wu's face jumped. He hurriedly pushed the hangden back into Shousheng's hand and said silently, Okay, the current account is the current account. The delivery tonight is the current account." Shousheng frowned and went back inside. He told Mrs. Lin about Yuchangxiang's coming to hunt for goods, and advised her, Teacher's wife. The president of the Chamber of Commerce came just now and indeed said that the master was doing well there and was not suffering any hardships, but he had to spend some money to get out. There's only 50 yuan in the store. Now Yuchangxiang is here to hunt for goods. Judging from this list, it's still about 150 yuan, so I'd better give it to them. It's important to rescue the master as soon as possible. When Mrs. Lin heard that she had to spend money again, she burst into tears. The beating was really loud. She just waved her hands and was speechless. She leaned her head on the table and beat the table loudly. Shousheng saw that there was no way to go, so he quietly left. But at the butterfly door, Miss Lin caught up with her. Her face was as white as death, her voice was trembling and hoarse, and she said hastily, "Mom is so angry. She always says that Dad has been killed by them. You, please promise Yuchangxiang save Dad as soon as possible. Brother Shousheng, you." When Miss Lin said this, she suddenly blushed and ran in quickly. Shousheng looked at her back and stood blankly for half a minute, then turned around and determined to take on the responsibility of poaching goods for Yuchangxiang. At least the junior sister agreed with him to do so. Dinner was already placed in the shop, and Shousheng didn't want to eat it. He immediately waited for Yuchangxiang to hand over the money. He took 100 in his hand and another 80 hidden beside him, and ran to find the president of the Chamber of Commerce. Half an hour later, Shousheng and Mr. Lin came back together. Run into the inner house. When she arrived, Mrs. Lin was shocked when she saw it. When she found out that it was Mr. Lin who was really alive, Mrs. Lin hurriedly crawled in front of the porcelain guanyin and kowtowed, which was louder than her snoring. Miss Lin stood beside her with bare eyes, as if she was about to cry, but also as if she was about to laugh. Shousheng took out a paper bag from his side, put it on the table and said, "That's an extra $80. Mr. Lin sighed, and after a while, he said breathlessly, "Just let me die over there and spend money to get it out. There is no money. Everyone is still dead." Mrs. Lin suddenly jumped up from the ground and wanted to speak anxiously, but a series of ughs blocked her words. Miss Lin held back her voice and sobbed and cried. Mr. Lin didn't cry yet and sighed again. After taking a breath, Jian swallowed and said, "The goods are hollowed out. The store can't be opened, and the debts are pressing hard. Master." Shousheng shouted, dipped his finger in the tea, and wrote the word "go" on the table for Mr. Lin to see. Mr. Lin shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He looked at Aunt Lin, looked at Miss Lin again. Another sigh. "Master. This is the only way. We put it together in the store and there is still 100 yuan. You can take it with you. It will be enough in a month or two. I will straighten things out with them." Shousheng whispered. But Mrs. Lin could hear it, and she suddenly suppressed her words. He rushed to shout. "You guys go too. You, Axiu. Just leave me here alone. I'll fight for my life." Ugh. Suddenly feeling unusually healthy, Mrs. Lin turned around and ran upstairs. Miss Lin called Mom and then chased after her. Mr. Lin looked at the stairs in confusion. "I felt like there was something important in my heart, but I couldn't remember it." Shousheng whispered again. "Master, you and my junior sister should go together. My junior sister is here, and my wife is worried. She always says that they are coming to rob." Mr. Lin nodded with tears in his eyes. "But I can't make up my mind." Shousheng couldn't help but the circles under his eyes were red. He sighed and walked around the table. Suddenly I heard Miss Lin crying. Mr. Lin and Shousheng were both jumped. When they arrived at the head of the stairs, Mrs. Lin was coming out of the room. He held a leather bag in his hand. Seeing that Mr. Lin and Shousheng were already at the head of the stairs, she retreated to her room and said, "Come here too and listen to my idea." In front of Mr. Lin and Shousheng, she pointed at the paper bag and said, "This is my private room, eh? The scene cost more than 200 yuan. Take half of it." "Well. Xiao, I decide how to allocate longevity." "Well, Axiu will go with her father tomorrow." I'm not leaving. Shousheng will stay with me for a few days before we talk." Knowing that I still have a few days to live, you just bow before me, I feel relieved." "Well." Aunt Lin held Miss Lin in one hand and Shousheng in the other, asking them to bow down. They all bowed, their faces flushed and their heads lowered. Shousheng glanced at Miss Lin secretly and saw a smile in her tears. Shousheng's heart skipped a beat. Instead, she shed 2 tears. Mr. Lin breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Okay, that's it. But Shousheng, you stay here to deal with them, you have to be careful in everything." 7. Lin's shop finally closed down. News of Boss Lin's escape spread throughout the town. Hengyuan village, among the creditors, first sent people to Lin's shop to seal up the underlying goods. They searched the account books again. Not a single one left. Ask Shousheng. Shousheng was lying in bed sick. Hengyuan village, among the creditors, first sent people to Lin's shop to seal up the underlying goods. They searched the account books again. Not a single one left. Ask Shousheng. Shousheng was lying in bed sick. I went to question Aunt Lin again. Mrs. Lin's answer was a barrage of hiccups, tears and runny nose. Because she is Aunt Lin, after all, people can't do anything about it. At 11 o'clock, a large group of creditors made an extremely loud noise in Lin's shop. Hengi Wanzwang and other creditors disputed how to distribute the underlying goods. Although the shop was empty, it didn't even include making money. It is enough to repay creditors 70%, but everyone only wants to get 90% or even 100% for themselves. The president of the Chamber of Commerce spoke so hard that his tongue was a little stiff, but there was no result. 2 policemen came, standing at the door with wooden sticks and shouting at the idle people watching the excitement. "Why don't you let me in? I have a savings of 300 yuan. My old boss." Mrs. Zhu San twisted her lips and argued with the police, trembling as she squeezed in the crowd. The vein on her forehead was as thick as her little finger. She squeezed for a while. Suddenly, I saw Widow Zhang holding her 5-year-old child, begging another policeman to let her in. The policeman squinted his eyes and pretended to tease the child, but secretly rubbed Widow Zhang's breasts with the back of his hand. "Sister-in-law Zhang." Mrs. Zhu San gave a breathless cry and sat on the edge of the stone steps, twisting her puckered lips vigorously. Widow Zhang turned around, looking for who was calling her, but the policeman shouted in a profane tone. "Don't be impatient. We'll go in after a while." Everyone who heard this started laughing. Widow Zhang pretended not to understand. With tears in her eyes, she took another step aimlessly. I happened to see Mrs. Zhu San sitting on the edge of the stone steps, panting. Widow Zhang also stumbled to the side of Mrs. Zhu San. Sitting on the edge of the stone steps, I suddenly burst into tears. She cried and murmured, My lord, you left me behind. You know how miserable I am. The bandit soldiers killed you. The day before yesterday was the 3rd anniversary. Boss Lin, who has no sons and no grandsons, collapsed his shop again. The hundreds or tens of dollars I made with my 10 fingers was thrown into the water, and it didn't make a sound. Ah yo. The life of the poor is miserable, and the rich are cruel. Seeing the mother cry, the child also cried. Widow Zhang hugged the child and cried even more sadly. Mrs. Zhu San did not cry. Nu raised a pair of red and sunken eyes and repeated one sentence like crazy, A poor person has a life, and a rich person also has a life. Without my money, I will fight for my life. At this time, a person squeezed out of the shop. It was Quoto Chen Laochi. His face was purple and blue, and while squeezing, he turned around and yelled, You gang of robbers. Look, you will be rewarded. The sky is burning, the earth is scorching, and one day it will be in my eyes, Chen Laochi. If you want to take the blame, let everyone eat it. It is fair to share it with one person. Chen Laochi was scolding vigorously when he saw Mrs. Zhu San and Widow Zhang, and called their names and said, Third wife, Mrs. Zhang, why are you sitting here crying? They have finished dividing the goods. I can't quarrel with more than 10 of them with one mouth. These bandits are unreasonable. He insists that our money is not accounted for. When Widow Zhang heard this, she cried even more bitterly. The policeman from before suddenly came over again, pushed Widow Zhang on the shoulder with a wooden stick and said, Hey, why are you crying? Your adoptive family is long dead. Who is crying now? He insists that our money is not accounted for. When Widow Zhang heard this, she cried even more bitterly. The policeman from before suddenly came over again, pushed Widow Zhang on the shoulder with a wooden stick and said, Hey, why are you crying? Your adoptive family is long dead. Who is crying now? Shit. People robbed us, do you want to tease women too? Chen Laochi shouted angrily and pushed the policeman hard. The policeman's eyes widened and he raised his stick to hit him. The idlers shouted and cursed the policeman. Another policeman ran over quickly, pulled Chen Laochi away and said, It's useless for you to argue here. We have no grudges against you. The Chamber of Commerce has called the gatekeepers. There is nothing we can do about this bowl of rice. Chen Laochi, go to the party headquarters and complain. A voice in the crowd shouted. From the sound of his voice, he knew it was the famous Yanhan monk Lu in the street. Go, go. See what they say. Many voices screamed. But the policeman who was the mediator sneered, pulled Chen Laochi's shoulder and said, I advise you to stop making trouble. What's the use of winning over there? You'd better wait for Boss Lin to come back and settle the score with him, he won't let it go in vain. Chen Laochi became angry and ran out of ideas. Unable to resist the idle people who encouraged him to go, he looked at Mrs. Zhu San and Widow Zhang and said, How about going? People over there are shouting to protect the poor every day. Good. Yesterday they detained Boss Lin to prevent him from escaping, and the poor man's money was nowhere to be found. Another person who wanted to go shouted in a longer voice. It seemed like he couldn't help it. Chen Laochi, the 3 of them and a group of idlers all went to the road where the party headquarters was. Widow Zhang was still crying along the way, cursing the bandit soldiers who killed her husband, cursing Boss Lin who had no sons and grandsons, and cursing the policeman who was like a vicious dog. When we almost arrived at our destination, I saw 4 policemen standing in front of the door, all holding sticks. They shouted from a distance, Go away. Don't come over. We are here to file a complaint. The Lin's shop has collapsed, and we can't even get the money we saved there. Chen Laochi was walking in the front row and also said loudly. But suddenly a black pockmarked person jumped out from behind the policeman, shouting and beating him angrily. But the policemen still stood and only used their mouths to threaten. The idlers behind Chen Laochi started to make a loud noise. Hey Motzi shouted angrily. You ignorant bitch. Do we care about your affairs here? Don't leave. Just shoot. He stamped his feet and shouted at the 4 policemen to start beating him. Chen Laochi was standing at the front and had already received several sticks. The idlers were in chaos. Zhu Sana was too old and fell down. Widow Zhang fell in panic. Shoes, when people hit them, fell to the ground. She rolled and rolled to avoid many jumping and stepping feet. She stood up and ran for a while, and then she realized that her child was gone. When I looked at the lapel, there were a few drops of blood. Oh. My baby. My sweetheart. The robber killed someone, Jade Emperor, help me.